Good afternoon. I'm Carmen Von Rohr, Research Manager at CRF, and I'd like to welcome you all to our summer lecture. We have with us today Richard Gerver, award-winning educator and author and former headmaster of the Grange Primary School, which he transformed into an acclaimed learning environment celebrated by UNESCO and the UK government. Richard is going to talk to us today about how education needs to evolve to ensure our young people have the skills to meet the future needs of society and business. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Richard, but please do feel free to pop questions and comments into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen as we go along, as we will have time for questions after his address. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carmen. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And I think really the best way I can start this presentation today is to frame it in one of the more surreal moments of the lived experience of the last 18 months or so. And it's really to go back to that fundamental question of why was it exactly that we started to hoard toilet paper? And I remember the first time I saw this happening, I was just coming back from work in Australia at the end of February 2020. I was in the departure lounge at the airport in Melbourne, and the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, came on the TVs in the departure lounge to beg people to stop hoarding loo roll. And it turns out that the Australian public were doing it because they'd seen the events that were happening in China. They weren't so much concerned about the pandemic at that time sweeping through Australia, but they were seeing that the factories were closing down, that office facilities were closing down in China. And the Australian people believed the vast majority of the manufacture of their toilet roll came from China. And so they went out panic buying. It was when Scott Morrison came on the TV to explain to them that over 90% of the manufacture actually was in Australia, that he tried to allay fears. I mean, I remember giggling, I've got to be honest. But when I landed 36 hours later in the UK, I realized we were doing the same thing. And it's just an interesting point to step back on. First of all, of course, the power of digital technology. Why were we doing it? Well, we were doing it because people in Australia had posted on social media the images and videos of shelves being stripped bare. And so people here immediately felt, well, maybe that's what we need to do. But maybe more pertinently here for our conversation this afternoon was this. We were all desperately scrabbling around to find a sense of control, of the security that comes with certainty. And in many ways, I think this is the core challenge for us when we're thinking about the future of education. You know, for generations, we have educated people pretty much in the same way, based on an industrial environment. We have educated people to seek out certainty at whatever level they are within that education process and journey. And when they find it, to lock it down and to protect it. So we look for our jobs for life if we can. We've looked for the certainty of doing the same thing in the same way, the kind of efficiency model of Taylorism. And education, and actually the way we raise our children, has been predicated on exactly that thinking. And what the pandemic, of course, has illustrated to us in a deeply amplified way, but something we've known for many, many years, is the world isn't a world of certainty anymore. It isn't a world that will continue to evolve through efficiency, that it's changing fast, that it's changing in deeply uncertain ways, whether it's economic shift, whether it's environmental shift or health shift, or all of those things combined. And it's why, in many ways, if we're to educate future generations in the right way to both be more prepared to deal with their future working lives or their future personal lives, we need to take a step back and pause at this juncture, I think, to think about what that might look like. And at this point, I want to introduce you to, some of you may recognize this woman, a remarkable individual. This is Manoush Shafiq. Manoush Shafiq was, until a while back, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. She was, for a long while, considered to be the front runner to become the first female governor of the Bank of England. And I still hope that is down the track and will happen. She's currently Director of Economics at the London School of Economics, and she is just extraordinary. A couple of years ago, I got the chance to hear her speak at Davos at the World Education Forum, and she was talking about education from her standpoint. And there are two things that I'd like to share with you that she said that day that I think have got profound resonance now. The first is this, and this is not a new trope. It's something we've been talking about in and around education for a very long time. You know, that anything that's routine or repetitive will be automated, that routine cognition is no longer the primary quality that we, you, all of us are looking for in our future employees, that actually more and more and more we've seen the desire for soft skills, for creativity, curiosity, collaborative abilities, research, the ability to problem solve, to take information, to synthesize it and to use it, which in many ways is still one of the great challenges and frictions within the education system, where the system on the whole in most developed countries around the world is still predicated on preparing people to take exams in order to gain qualifications, which often happens at the expense of developing the real knowledge and skills and attributes that our young people need and that we all need in order to do more than survive in the future. But it was the second thing she said in 2018 that I found particularly resonant and powerful, given the lived experience of the last few years. And it's this. I won't read it to you, but I think what's really important there is to pick up on this thing, that this rise of populism, the polarization that we've seen in societies around the world, whether it's in Europe through the rise of the right or the debates and challenges around Brexit, whether it's been in the US or in Brazil, where populist presidents have come to power. This point that the people that voted for those populist movements and have been seduced by those polarizations aren't stupid people. They may be undereducated, but they're not stupid. And I think this is really powerful in terms of the resonance of the challenge for us in the future of education, because as I said at the beginning, we have educated people to lead lives of certainty with the premise that they will be rewarded when they find it and hold on to it. So millions of people around the world have got their heads down, done what they were asked, and then had those certainties ripped from them. And as a result, we've created climates of anger where those people felt lied to, where they weren't given the promises that were made to them, and they have reacted against that. And again, I think it's really important that we start to therefore take a step back and ask the question, how do we prepare people personally and professionally through education to lead lives that aren't about certainty, that aren't about securing those certainties, that are about creating more agile people, more entrepreneurial people, people that can not just survive periods of change, but can thrive during them, and periods of uncertainty? How do we unlock the potential of our human creativity and curiosity in order to drive all of our lives forwards? You know, it's really interesting that when I was training to be a young teacher, I remember one of my lecturers saying something to me that stuck with me ever since. I don't know how she quantified it through a percentage, but the sentiment was fascinating, because she said we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're 5 years of age. Now, I'm not talking about the stuff that comes through experience, but if you think about it, we learn, most of us, to walk and talk. We learn to understand body language, vocal intonation, facial expression. We learn to make sense of the sensory world around us. That learning curve is extraordinary. But as we get older, that accelerated ability to learn diminishes and diminishes and diminishes. Let me give you an example of that. And I think this is the question. This is the way we need to think about the re-engineering of education. This is someone, again, I don't know how many of you may recognize. This is Barry Barish. Barry Barish, as well as I think some people have said, looking a little bit like my grandfather, and frankly, I wish. Barry Barish was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics, a man many consider to be up there alongside people like Stephen Hawking as one of the greatest minds of the modern age. He got his Nobel Prize actually for his team's research into gravitational waves. And as I stare earnestly into this camera like I know what that is, I have to confess I really don't. To me, it sounds like a hair care product, but then I was never a scientist. But I asked Barry about how he went about recruiting the team of researchers that he had on board as they evolved the work they did that eventually led to a Nobel Prize. And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, you know, in a way, we were incredibly fortunate, Richard, because of the high profile of what we were doing. We had over 3,500 serious applications. I said, can you just quantify that for me? What do you mean by serious applications? He said, oh, these were people with at least one, most had 2 doctorates in fields of science. They'd had their abstracts published in the most powerful and important journals. So these were all highly qualified people. I said, so how on earth did you strip that down to what was the number you had on your team? He said 138 funded places. I said, so how did you get from 3,500 to 138? He said, well, actually, there were 2 questions we asked. The first was this. He said, I needed 3-dimensional people on my team. He said, the problem with science, as with a number of other walks of life, is the older you get, the more established you become in your field of knowledge or experience or expertise or area of work. You blinker in, and you blinker in on the specialism of what you do. And the problem with that is that you surround yourself and work all the time with other people who are similar in terms of their experiences, their knowledge, their understanding, their interest. He said, and if what you're trying to do is innovate, to continue to learn, to explore new patterns and methodologies, you need fresh stimulus. You need 3-dimensional people. He said, so nobody made it onto my team if they hadn't got recent experience of the arts and humanities, and if they didn't have really interesting hobbies on their CVs, as well as their expertise in their chosen field. Now, I think that has a profound challenge to all of us, whether we're working in HR and employability and employment, or whether, more importantly, we're working in education. That as we go through the education journey, we make sure there are opportunities to keep broadening people's horizons rather than narrowing them down into silos and single-focused disciplines. The second thing he said is one of my favorite things actually anyone's ever said to me. He said, nobody made it onto our team if they didn't have the ability to ask stupid questions. And again, we could probably spend an entire day debating about whether there is such a thing, but I think we all understand what we mean when we're talking about that, and the stifling environment of being in meetings where people don't ask them even though they want to, or people don't understand and feel they'll be judged if they say the wrong thing in the wrong way. And again, you know, that starts in education. When we're very young, when we're those kids under 5, imagine that we're all gamblers. And because as very young children, we don't see mistake making or getting stuff wrong as a bad thing. And please excuse my dog barking in the background. I think the post person has just arrived. I hope you can all still hear me, the nature of the world we're now living in. When we're very young children, we don't mind playing games where there's a chance we might lose. And actually, we've got hundreds of poker chips of resilience, self-confidence, self-esteem. We'll chuck poker chips on red or black or odd or even as we walk into the roulette room and we're spinning the wheel and rolling the ball. Because the thing is, if it comes up red or black or odd or even different numbers, it doesn't matter. We've got loads of poker chips of esteem, of self-confidence left. And if we make a mistake, we'll play with more. It doesn't matter. But as we get older, for many of us, the number of those poker chips diminish because we're taught from quite a young age that the currency of clever is to get stuff right. And so how many people do you know who now walk into the casino that is a meeting or a professional development opportunity, and they lurk in the shadows, not because they don't want to play the game, because they're terrified that if they put the poker chip on red and it comes up black, or they put it on odd and it comes up even, they've got nothing left. And so one of the things we need to focus on far more, I think, is the challenge of how we galvanize and develop the number of poker chips we have in our bag as we go through our lives, and particularly in our professional environments, maybe. And some of the answer, I think, certainly for me as an educator, lies looking outside of education. And I don't know how many of you have come across this, but a few years ago, I came across the research work done at Google into what made the most successful teams within that organization. And the research is available online. You can find it, I think, to download for free, and it's called Project Aristotle. There were actually two research programs. One which was called Project Aristotle, which looked at the cultures of the most successful teams. And the other was Project Oxygen, which looked at what made the most successful leaders the most successful leaders. But I want to focus a little bit on the culture of what made the most successful teams so, because again, I think it has a profound impact on the narrative and the questions we should be threading and developing around the future of education. So the findings were these, and this won't be new to any of you in your expertise and professional lives, but these need to be more front and center around the dialogue around education. You know, first and foremost, the most successful teams at Google operate under very strong conditions of psychological safety. That there's high trust, which of course comes from dependability. The fact that everybody is able to rely on everybody else, every other cog in the machine, knowing that everyone else in that team will pull their weight and do what's expected of them. That there is a real clarity of structure and expectation about who does what and where they fit within that team, no matter where they are in the hierarchy, whether they're somebody that cleans the offices or leads a creative team or a programming team. Everybody sees everybody else's role as important. And of course, that there's a profound meaning to what it is they're doing every minute of every day, that everybody feels that there is genuine value to what they bring into that team. And finally, one of those things I think we see so sadly often, not just in education, but in every walk of life, that people have the opportunity to truly celebrate the impact they're having on themselves, on each other, on their communities, on their workplace, on their school. We're always so busy going, right, what's the next challenge? What's the next thing we're dealing with? What's the next thing we need to do in the education journey? That sometimes I don't think we take enough time to celebrate the real progress that each and every one of us is making. And that leads me on to the next challenge and thought, which actually comes from this organization, which many of you will recognize, the OECD. So as well as producing global information and research into global economics, some of you will know that they have a profound impact on education policy around the world because they rank countries by academic performance. And we often hear here in the UK about how bad we are because of where we rank in league tables. My sadness around that, though, is very rarely do we take a step back to truly interrogate and explore the research and findings in detail. And in 2013, the OECD produced a global report, which almost went under the radar, which is well worth revisiting in whatever capacity you work, because it was the first global report into the links between education, employability, and skills. And it had some profound things through that report that it uncovered, not just by talking to educators and people within the education sphere, but it also talked to 3,000 of the world's largest employers and tried to correlate what exactly the future of education needed to look like. And I think it's really important that we raise these issues again now, because I'm not sure how successful through policy or design we've really been. So here are the key findings from that report. The first is that the countries that focus too heavily on the acquisition of formal qualifications for young people over the actual development of knowledge, skills, attributes, and behaviors are the countries where young people will find it increasingly difficult to get work. I'm sure many of you are having the dialogues through your organizations about what is it you really need to be looking for your future employees, and where are you going to find that talent pool. The second thing, which I think was really interesting and provocative, was the fact that, as I mirrored at the start through what Manoush had to say, the importance of interpersonal skills and those personal soft skills are now rapidly overtaking the need for routine cognition. We need people to be more agile, creative, problem-solving, innovative, collaborative. That the education system needs to shape future generations to be able to learn and adapt and change throughout their lives. And again, when we think about the last 15 or so years, the fallout of the global economic crisis, the fallout that will come from the pandemic, that ability for people to do that through their lives and actually to access education, not just until they're 21 or 22, but actually throughout their lives, becomes so deeply important as the world shifts and changes and as our needs shift and change. And how can we all create that environment? Which leads to the fourth finding, which is that there need to be far closer links between the worlds of education and work. We need to stop living in two separate silos, and we need to broker new relations, so that we see this process as one lifelong narrative, that one isn't in opposition to or preparation for the other. And actually, I urge all of you, if you haven't already, to forge way closer links with the education community so that we can all try and frame a new narrative. And two more thoughts for you before I hand back over to Carmen to take maybe some questions. And they're two meetings that I've had that I think have really crystallized for me the challenge. Both of them with remarkable human beings who are both, frankly, on my top 10 list of people I wished I could have met and have had the incredible privilege of so doing. The first of those people is the co-founder of Apple, Steve Wozniak. And I have to tell you this because to this day, it makes me feel cold how stupid I was on my meeting with Steve Wozniak. The first thing I said to him was, and boy, do I regret it now, can I have a selfie? I was a bit of a fanboy, you see. And it was one of those moments where he was very obliging and kind. And we looked up into the camera on my phone in the same painful moment, because we both realized in that same second that I was asking him to have a selfie taken on a Samsung. So you can imagine, I didn't think I was going to get much of a conversation out of him, but he was kind, generous, and forgave me. And there's something I want to share with you that I think is a really interesting challenge. He said, Richard, when Apple really started to expand, and it happened quite quickly, 1 minute we were working out of Steve Jobs' stepdad's garage, and we were making voice-changing transmitters, which we sold to transistors that we sold to our friends so that they could make prank phone calls. He said, we really exploded because up until that point, we just gathered our friends together. It was like a computer club, our friends and friends of friends, and we were doing stuff in this garage. But because of Jobs, we started to explode into a bigger environment. And that meant we were going to have to hire people that we didn't know. So one night, he said, Jobs and I went out for a beer to talk about the future. He said, and there's a lot of rubbish written about Steve Jobs. But he said that night over that beer, he did say something interesting to me, which was, if we're a company that just makes stuff, we will find it hard to exist within 5 years in the nature of the markets we now work. So just having technically brilliant people isn't going to be enough. We need to be a company, if we're to survive and thrive, that gives the world stuff it doesn't know it needs yet. And that means we need something different. And that night they came up with a mantra, which again, some of you may know. And it's a mantra that was said to me, it must work, Richard, because Apple still use it as a core philosophy for their hiring program now. And it was this. They said, at Apple, we will never employ anyone who needs managing. And again, I think that's a wonderful framed question for the challenge for the future of education. Rather than promoting reliance culture, how do we create that entrepreneurial spirit of people that can truly think and problem solve and manage themselves? And it's not going to happen implicitly. We have to make it more explicit. And that leads me to my final name drop, and it's a big finish, I'm afraid, and one that is almost a contractual obligation now for anyone I work with, for no one else's benefit than mine. Because just before lockdown, I got to meet the number 2 person on my fantasy dinner party list. Funnily enough, the number 1 person is this guy's wife. And I still hope to this day that one day I get to meet her too. But he'll do, because that couple of years ago, I got the opportunity to meet with him. Couple of things just to say about this picture. The first is it isn't a waxwork. It really is President Obama. The second thing is, look how pleased he is to see me. Clearly, I was on his fantasy dinner party list too. Who knew? And wow. And the third thing is, I have learned through lockdown how amazing it is, how many chins a beard can hide. So this is definitely a keeper. But as I finish, I want to share a thought with you of something he said to me. Because again, I think it's profoundly important for education and beyond. I got the chance to ask him one question, and that question was this. What's the most important thing you learned during your time in the White House? And he was so honest, so authentic, so down to earth. And he flashed that winning smile and he said to me, I'll tell you. He said, when I first arrived in the White House, Richard, I was able to surround myself with the greatest technical minds on earth. The greatest political strategists, economists, scientists, the greatest technicians from their field. He said, but when I look back on those 8 years, what I reflect on is this, that virtually none of the problems that crossed my desk when you truly understood their foundation were actually technical by nature. They were human. They were about love, anger, jealousy, greed, tribalism, fear. He said, and all too often our reflex is to design our way out of the challenges we face before we truly understand the human issues behind them. And if I had one criticism and one word of advice for the future of education, it's exactly that. We have spent far too much time and resource and energy in leaping straight to the systemic and the structural without truly understanding the human challenge first. And I think for me, that is the core of what we need to do now as we move hopefully into a post-pandemic era, reflect on the challenges we've all faced and look to create an education system that is not just fit for our future, but ensures that more of our young people do more than survive, but thrive in whatever that changing world throws at them. So I know I've overrun by a minute or two, but thank you so much for listening. Carmen, I'm going to hand back over to you, and I'd love to take some questions. Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thank you, Richard. That was really insightful, and I'm sure we all do have lots of questions. So again, everybody, please do use the chat to post a question, and I'll pose it to Richard. Richard, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I have one. I can start things off. Listening to you talking about Barry Barish and the importance of being well-rounded and breadth, to complement depth. I think of how we often see in the news stories about no platforming and safe spaces at universities. And sometimes it feels like there's a resistance among younger generations to being exposed to any views or ideas that they might disagree with, which is sort of contrary to breadth, to curiosity, that vital trait. And I wonder, do you think this is a problem, or is it a vocal minority, or is it a larger trend? And if so, how would we best address that?
You know what? I do think it's a challenge. I do think it's a problem. I do think it's something we need to be much clearer about. And also, I'm not entirely sure that the polarized world we live in is terribly helpful for all of that, because, with social media, with digital technology, with some of the crass and angry debates on a human level we've had around things like Brexit and Trump and all of those kind of things, I think young people feel really vulnerable and really scared by that world that they see projected by, if you like, our adult community. And it's partly why I think there's an increasing resistance to meaningful debate. I think, again, one of the things that education needs to support is helping young people understand the power of constructive debate, of discussion, of sharing and understanding, if not agreeing with other people's views. Because the truth about innovation and creativity is that it is never born out of a sterile environment. It's born out of conflicting points of view. You know, Barry Barish's point about bringing different groups of people together is vital to the evolution of anything. And I think one of the things we need to do much younger with children is help them understand the power of debate, the nuance of being able to take in each other's viewpoints. And it's something we actually teach very well in very young children. But as kids get older and the system becomes more prescriptive, and if you like more black and white, do this, this will happen, do this, this will happen, we've jettisoned so much of that wonderful opportunity. You know, I hesitate to say it. I was educated in the private sector, but spent my entire teaching career in the public sector. The opportunity for those wider experiences that private education offers is something we need to get out at a much more profound level across our communities. I was doing an event for a university just the other day, actually, talking to a number of their senior staff. And it was the number one fear at university level, that there is a lockdown on meaningful debate and opportunity for people to truly experience expansive, you know, ideologies and what have you. So it's definitely something we need to work on. But I think one of the things we need to do, if we can, obviously, is change the education system. But beyond that, in our workplaces, is maybe create opportunities for the kind of debates some of us used to have in our youth, to create opportunities for people with different viewpoints in a company to have open conversations, and for us to model those behaviors and hopefully remove some of the fear from it and allow people to realize that it's a deeply constructive and important thing, both for human evolution and for professional and corporate evolution too.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Richard. I hadn't really given a lot of thought to the angle of fear and not having those skills rather than just being a sort of thing. So great. We do have some more questions coming in now, so I will pose a few of these. From Deborah Stratza, we have, are there specific areas of national curriculum that you would change? Would you give schools, teachers more freedom to design?
Yeah, I absolutely would. I think what's really important is to remember and reflect that every community in our society is different, and therefore the lived experience of every young person within those communities are different, which means what they need to learn and be immersed in needs to be different. You know, we've seen that exposed, I think, during the online learning that's had to go on at various stages during the pandemic. You know, there's been an obsessional conversation about the digital divide, but actually one of the things I want to see a greater conversation around is around the analog divide. You know, that equity of opportunity for young people to experience green spaces, to go to museums and galleries, to go to a cinema, to go on holiday, to go to a library or have access to books, you know. And I think one of the really important things we need to do is make sure that each school genuinely has the opportunity to personalize its curriculum. I also think we need to broaden the discussion in this country, which has become increasingly around the traditional philosophy of academic development and pursuit. And I'm not anti, it's not this polarized debate, but we've gone too far down the line of, you know, routine cognition and ensuring children are prepared to take exams and have that academic recall. And as a result, we've lost some of that wider and more expansive opportunity young people need. And it's why I think that interconnection and relationship, if we can reestablish it better between education and the business and corporate sector, is so vitally important. So those two things, one, really, we need to allow schools to be able to develop national curriculum based on their own circumstance and context. And we need to have a more expansive opportunity for young people and for people to collaborate across building that curriculum.
Okay, thank you. I think that leads nicely into another question that we have from Paula Bartlett, which is, when we provide experiences for young people in the workplace, and she's looking at ages 11 to 18, what do you think are the key experiences that we should aim to provide?
I think what's really, really important is to let young people see the human interactions that are necessary, the quality of some of those basic skills and disciplines. You know, why, for example, being at work on time, understanding that it's really important to listen to other people's viewpoints, to be able to see some of those soft skills developments. I think often what we do is we put young people in positions where they can see people do their job, but actually a lot of that soft stuff, the soft interaction, is the stuff that young people, I think, need to see more of, whilst at the same time helping them understand some of the disciplines and expectations and why they're important over and above just saying they're important, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it reminds me, in some of CRF's research, we talked to people about challenges during the pandemic and onboarding particularly new people to the workforce, and losing that informal knowledge that you pick up in the office was a critical thing that companies are grappling with. We have a question from Victor Phillip. Why are these changes happening so slowly? I just finished college. We were talking about the things you mentioned today years and years ago with school colleagues, and I still don't see major changes. What's the key obstacle?
Gosh, I mean, I think that is the profound question. And I think the problem in so many ways is the people who are setting policy are still obsessed with making the system run more efficiently, believing that's the answer, rather than truly understanding the reflection of wider society, which is far more complex. You know, the problem is every debate we have about new fields within education, whether it's the ramifications of new technologies or whatever else it might be, always makes the mistake of coming back to that point of, but how do we get more kids through exams? You know, the example I often give is, in a way, the challenge would be like giving Lorraine Pascal or Heston Blumenthal, you know, one of the great cooks or chefs, the real innovators, and saying to them, go away and create something new. And you can imagine Lorraine or Heston being really fired up by that challenge. And then just as they're about to go off to their lab or kitchen, going, whoa, just before you go, though, one thing I need to ask you is you need to make sure whatever you create looks and tastes just like this chocolate cake. Right. And that's been the paralysis in education. We talk about innovation, we talk about transformation and evolution, but we keep judging schools on the way we were judging them 20, 30 years ago. And until we actually have time and courage to redesign the system and then find new methodologies to hold that system to account, both for individual students and more widely as a system, we'll keep going down that route of the cyclical route towards the traditional efficiencies. And so we need to have a greater level of courage. One or two countries, and sorry for the long-winded answer, have started to do that, you know. And one of the great successes, many people will know about the successes of the education system in Finland. And of course, a lot of that is geographic and we can't replicate what they did. But what they did do 15 to 20 years ago is they said, we need to remove policy wonks from the front line of education development and actually ask educators to transform education, and then we will hold their system to account rather than us constantly meddling in the system itself. So if there's one lesson we can learn, it's we have to be better at divorcing political influence on the structure and design of education away from the education process itself.
Well, no small challenge.
Oh, yeah, easy.
We have a question from David North. How do we blend the need for more focus on arts and creativity with the recent emphasis on STEM subjects? Again,
you know, I think this is hugely important. And I think it's really, you know, the Barry Barish point is a really powerful one. And we need to get that narrative out there. Barry Barish, who is one of the world's great scientific minds, advocating that people didn't make it onto his research team if they didn't have arts in their background, for exactly the reason that David's arguing. You know, we need to have people who have expansive viewpoints, have ways of seeing the world in different ways, of bringing those people together to create new opportunities. And the truth is that we are continuing to elegantly prepare people for a world that doesn't exist yet. And we have to understand that whilst the STEM subjects are deeply, vitally important, you know, when I talk to the CEOs of some of the world's biggest tech and pharmaceutical companies, what they say to me is, Richard, we've got all the technical expertise we need. What we need is a diversity of thought and people from different backgrounds. We need artists and creatives. Again, using the culinary analogy. There's a wonderful chef some people again may have heard of called Ferran Adria, who for about a decade was considered to be the world's greatest cook. He was the man actually who influenced people like Heston Blumenthal. He had a restaurant in Barcelona called El Bulli, I think, which he shut down at the peak of its powers because he said, the problem is, Richard, I'm just surrounded by other people who do what I do. And although we're trying to be innovative, we're kind of got a shelf life. And so what he did instead was create something called El Torla. And what he does now is he brings people together from all kinds of walks of life, science, culinary arts, dance, music, whatever. And he'll put them into a space for a couple of weeks and say, what I want you to do is reinvent the notion of soup. For example, the reason he does that is if all you do is put chefs in a room, they'll always come up with a tweak. If you put people from that diversity of backgrounds in a room, they come up with something refreshing, different and new. And we have to help the government understand that that's the kind of system we need moving forward for global education. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to struggle in the employment sector to find the right people to fill our jobs.
That's a really great example. There's so many good things coming in on the chat. There are two questions here that I think sort of fit together, so I'll ask them together. Rachel Rose says, there still seems to be a huge disconnect between what the education sector, specifically in the UK, but probably elsewhere, places value on and what the world of work does. How can we help to educate the educators? And I think that fits nicely with what Deborah Strassa asks. Do we need to rethink how we train teachers, perhaps including time in business?
First of all, can I just say on a personal note, I'm assuming that is the same Rachel Rose who was one of my best friends at school. I look forward to finding that out later, because if it is, what an amazing thrill. And I hope I've made you proud, Rachel, if it is the same Rachel I last saw when we were 18. The second thing I would say to both of their points is yes. We have to give teachers a broader set of experiences. You know, like most fields of employment, teachers through their professional development end up going on courses run by teachers to teach them how to be more efficient at what they do, rather than broadening their horizons. We also take often young people from school, they go into college, they train to be teachers, they go into school to be teachers, and they've never had a lived experience. One of the really interesting things that happens in Australia is every 7 years, professional teachers get the opportunity to apply for long service leave, where they can go and travel, they can go and spend time in another sector, just immersing themselves in other things so that they bring back to their jobs a wider understanding of the world they're preparing young people for. So we absolutely do. And by the way, I don't think it's a one-way transaction. I actually also believe there's a huge amount that people in the business sector can learn around human leadership skills from the very best teachers and educators. You know, I've made a 15-year career now out of talking to senior leaders outside of education about the strategies I'd use on a wet Thursday afternoon to inspire an RC group of 12-year-olds. And actually, the point is the methodologies can be transactional. And I think what I'd love to see is a greater commitment towards a professional development program which broadens everybody's horizons and gives everyone the opportunity to share their expertise and skills more. We have to create one knitted narrative rather than believing that education and employment are in two separate silos.
Mm. Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. I had posed a question while you were talking to the audience about whether there were any good examples of bringing together business working more closely with the education system. And so I want to highlight a comment from Neil Hayward at HS2, who says, over 15,000 school children have taken part in one of HS2's STEM workshops that are designed to inspire the next generation to think about what's possible for them. We try to get involved in all age groups and in communities up and down the line of route. Our emphasis is on essential skills, creativity, problem solving, and teamwork. So I think we do agree with what Richard says, but the education sector seems to be more rigid and one size fits all. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's right. I think to an extent, to defend my former profession, it's not often through want of trying. The pressure they're under to primarily deliver on those narrow sets of results means schools often would love to embrace those kind of wider opportunities, but are terrified about taking time out perversely from the courses and syllabuses they're running and what impact that might have on the outcome of the exam system. And yet again, it's another example that I think there is far more willingness, but the problem is the fear. And actually, the way I think we get over that is to help schools understand that these two things aren't diametrically opposed, that by giving young people the opportunities that HS2 offer, for example, it's not in adversity to preparing kids to take their exams or do the standard things, but actually they can have powerful impact on them. You know, the same thing is true of sports and the arts and music and culture, that the transferable skills are often not explicit enough, and we need be better at threading those narratives. And to give you another, just if I can, I remember a number of years ago, gosh, maybe over a decade ago now, visiting the water ministry in the Netherlands, which for some countries may not sound overly sexy. I mean, obviously for places like the Emirates, it is for one reason. And in the Netherlands, it clearly is for another, you know, because they're in a floodplain. And one of the programs they used to run at the water ministry was to bring in a group of undergraduates every summer during their vacation from a whole range of different backgrounds, from different corners of the world. And the water ministry would present some of the real challenges they were dealing with inside their organization. And those young people would have the summer to come up with potential solutions. And what I loved about that idea was, first of all, the water ministry broadening young people's opportunity to collaborate, to experience something different, often not from the fields that people would choose to go into work in a water ministry, but also that those young people often crack the problems that the people inside the ministry have been juggling with for a long time. I am such an advocate of those kinds of partnerships that HS2 advocate, and I would love to find ways to broker more of them.
Yeah, great answer and great example. And I'm reminded something really interesting I heard about employer brand the other day, just this project focus in a non-sexy industry, that brands are sort of over, and that it's really a way for a sort of unsexy company to attract young people is by emphasizing the cool projects and articulating what it is that you're going to work on. And so, yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to squeeze in one last question before we go to networking. Do you think that spirituality, not necessarily religious, and connection has been lost, and whether connecting young people with basic gratitude and appreciation for the world around them would deepen their education experience?
Oh, my goodness me. I absolutely do. I think it's one of those things, you know, in the constant march towards new and the shiny, and everyone in education, and I think in other walks of life too, believing the answer lies in whatever the next big sexy innovation is, we often leave behind some of the most powerful and important parts of our lived experience. And I think the pandemic again has illustrated that so powerfully in the education sector. I mean, again, if I can end with one personal example, you know, I don't have many memories as a young child. I think it must just be my age, to be honest with you. But I remember profoundly 1976. I was 7 years of age. And for those of us that were alive then will remember, it was the summer. It was the year of the drought and the heat wave, which as kids, we were totally unaware of the bigger impact. We just loved the fact it was endless sunshine and warmth. And I remember being at my local urban primary school at the time as a 7-year-old, and coming back from lunch one day for some unaccountable reason, having been fed in the middle of like 100 degrees of heat, steamed cabbage, mashed potatoes, sausages, gravy, and more worryingly, a hot steamed pudding and custard, which could only ever happen in the UK in a heat wave. Going back to class, Miss Fraser was my teacher. And she was doing the registration, and after registration, she said, "Children," and I think it was possibly because of the byproduct of the lunch we'd just had and the heat. She said, "Rather than doing mathematics this afternoon, would you like to go across the road to the park and I'll read you a story," which of course we all jumped at. And these were in the days before risk assessments and all that kind of stuff. It's a miracle any of us survived, frankly. Anyway, we walked across the road to the local park, and I have this clear memory, telling it to you now as if it was yesterday, of lying under a willow tree, feeling the grass tickle my neck, the fronds of the willow branches just swaying gently in the breeze, seeing the sunshine, and listening to Miss Fraser's voice as she was reading us a story. And as a 7-year-old thinking, I'm not sure life will ever get any better than this, that spiritual connection to the world. And sadly, I think so much of that has been jettisoned. And the last 2 years, if it's taught us nothing else, has taught us we have to reconnect to those things, both as children and as adults. And certainly within education, we need to work harder, I think, at creating those experiences again for our kids.